Good evening. My name is Paul Dornan. I serve as chair of the McClendon Scholar in Residence Council. On behalf of the council and the New York Avenue Presbyterian Church, here in Washington, D.C., I greet you this evening. We are so grateful to be able to share a conversation about the latest PBS film, Sabbath, produced by Journey Films. Since 2006, the McClendon Scholar in Residence program has hosted profound and enlivening lectures, sermons, and conversations by and with 52 noted teachers, pastors, political leaders, and journalists. We have also sponsored the showing of 5 previous films produced by Journey Films and directed by Martin Doblmeier, who is with us again tonight. My invocation for this evening is an adaptation of a prayer of the Reverend Jack McClendon, whose gracious bequest some years ago made the Scholar in Residence program possible. Let us pray. Gracious God, we are grateful for a time when we can catch our breath, rest from our labors, move out of our frantic, frenetic schedules into a moment when clock time is not measured and appointments and arrival times are unimportant. In these moments, equip us to measure time by your sacred scale. 1,000 years are but a day, and 1,000,000 years but an hour. Minister to our hurried, harrowed spirits. By your grace and plenteous mercy, grant us Sabbath rest. Amen. Again, welcome to this conversation.
Good evening, and I want to join Paul in welcoming you to this evening's program. Thank you, Paul, for that invocation. It's wonderful to hear the words of Reverend Jack McClendon in here at this McClendon Scholar program that he initiated so many years ago. As always, it's a pleasure to welcome people from all over the Washington, D.C. area where our church is located, as well as people around the country. During the years of the pandemic and the growth of webinars, we've made contact with thousands of people in states all across the union, and we're delighted to have your participation here this evening. We always like knowing who's with us. Some of you have already started typing in some comments in chat to let us know your name and that you're here, and I invite you to do that. Type in your name, and if you're with a particular congregation or organization, maybe type that into. We like to see where people are joining us all around the country, and you see people starting to give examples of where they're from, and others take time to continue to do that. Again, just delighted to have you with us. As you're looking at chat, I want to ask you another question and give you another opportunity to respond in addition to your name. As Paul mentioned in the introduction, this is the 6th program that we have done with Martin Doblmeier's films through Journey Films. And I want to ask you a question. How many Martin Doblmeier films have you seen? Have you seen one of them? Did you see one in the prophetic series on Bonhoeffer and Heschel and Thurman and Dorothy Day? Niebuhr, one of those, or did you see more? Did you see some of the other award-winning films he's made? So type in, have you seen one maybe film, 2, or perhaps some of you have seen 3 or more, and some of you are starting to list the ones you've seen. Mention one that's particularly helpful to you or that you found interesting if you want to do that. But just to check in a little bit on your experience with the films made by our guest tonight, Martin Doblmeier, and his companions at Journey Films. As you know, this evening's program is a panel discussion, and we're going to jump right into that in a moment. And we will have Martin Doblmeier with us, as well as 2 scholars who appear in the film, Dr. Judy Fentress Williams and Reverend J. Dana Trent. Now, I hope you watched the film, but want you to know that's not necessary in order to enjoy and benefit from this program. We'll be showing a few clips from the film and also explaining some other parts of it so you can follow the discussion even if you haven't watched the film yet. And I say yet because I'm assuming that after tonight's discussion, you're going to want to watch it in full, and I hope that all of you will do that. There also will be a recording of this webinar. It's already in place, and it'll be available to everyone who registers afterwards. And if you want to view this again or share it with others, you'll be able to do that. Near the end of the panel discussion, we will have a time to take your questions. I invite you to identify the question space. It's probably in the bottom, in the middle it is on mine, the Q&A. And if you have questions that come up during the conversation, please type them in there. Now make your questions as specific as you can, be brief, so we can really zero in on what you want the panel to talk about. And maybe you don't have an exact question, but you'd like them to talk more about a comment they made or more about something you saw in the film when you were watching the film. So you can just mention that, have them say more about this, and I'll be scanning the Q&A and looking for suggestions of questions to bring into our conversation as we go along. All right, so I'll be bringing on, introducing Judy Fentress-Williams and Dana Trent in a few moments. But first, I want to introduce and bring on Martin Doblmeier. Martin is an award-winning filmmaker who founded Journey Films in 1983. Journey Films is a television and film production company based in Alexandria, Virginia, that specializes in films on religion, faith, and spirituality. Journey Films has produced more than 35 documentary films that have aired on PBS, ABC, NBC, the BBC, and broadcast outlets around the world, where they've been translated into more than a dozen languages. Martin has won numerous awards for his films, including 10 Gabriel Awards for the nation's best film on the topic of religion. Our McClendon Scholar Program has benefited greatly from his films and discussions around them, and it is a pleasure to once again have him with us. I'd like to introduce and bring on Martin Doblmeier.
Well, thank you, Theo. It's great to be back with you again. I've always had a wonderful experience every time we've gotten together. You and everyone at New York Avenue and the McClendon Scholar Program have just been terrific. And so I'm glad that there's been this wonderful symmetry that's worked out over so many years now. You do great things at New York Avenue, and we're honored to be associated with you.
Well, it's a pleasure to have the connection over these years. And, we had those great in-person programs. And then when the pandemic came, I wondered if we'd be able to carry on. And we've had some great webinars. So it's great to be able to do it in both situations. So as we start, Martin, say a little bit about why you wanted to make this film. You've made these films on great historical figures, issues, a number of things. What led you to make Sabbath?
Well, we've done a lot of biographies over the years. You know that. You presented a lot of the biographies, but I'm home. It's COVID. Everything is shut down. I'm connecting with friends and pastors and associates, and I'm just sort of feeling the collective angst that's going on, and realizing that it really doubles back to Sabbath. For the last film that I did, which was on Abraham Joshua Heschel, I reread the book, The Sabbath. It's a classic work. And before that, I had done films on Seventh-day Adventists, and they're a community of people, a denomination that really honors and has reverence for the Sabbath. So all these ideas are sort of collectively coming together for me, and I'm just thinking, let's start looking into it. And that's the first step. You look into it, and you begin to realize that this topic is so much deeper than you would realize on a glimpse, on the first look. And the more we looked into it, the more we liked the people that were writing about it, thinking about it, and doing things related to Sabbath. And that was it. We jumped in full commitment to it, and we just feel lucky that we were actually able to get it done during the tail end of the pandemic, which I I'm always wondering how did we get this even done? But we did, and I think we have in some ways a document of where America was. We shot most of it in 2022, and that was really a curious time. Churches were struggling to get back into form. What was going on? Some churches haven't come back, but I've been very surprised too to see the positive response from the media and from public television. The number of broadcasts have already begun to roll out very, very well, and we're excited about all.
Yeah,
that.
it seems to have touched a nerve in the culture and some of the. You say was deeper than you thought as you got into it. What were some of the things that you learned or that surprised you when you began to do this research and put a film together around Sabbath?
Well, one of the nice comments that we're hearing on a regular basis is, it's so diverse. They're seeing so many different expressions. And what I think is really interesting is that you realize that there may not always be a commonality of practice, but there's a deep sense of reverence and value for Sabbath that goes across denominational barriers. And that's the first thing that I came to appreciate. And so far, there's not been any pushback, and I hope not to receive any, from one denomination saying, well, we can't accept the way that another denomination or another presentation of Sabbath works. From Jews to Christians to Muslims, they've all said, no, this is something that's key to us, and we're pleased to share it. And we're happy to engage with other faith traditions in exploring it. It becomes safe, common ground for a new level of exploration between the traditions. And I think that says a lot for the topic of Sabbath, the universality of it, I think, first of all, and the seriousness with which people of faith traditions take it.
Yeah, no, that's great. We'll see some of those themes as we talk about the film and as we look at some of these clips. Let's start with looking at the trailer, which introduces many of the themes and ideas that are in the film.
"6 days you may labor and do all your work.
But the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God.
Keep it separate. Keep it set apart from the ordinary rhythm of time."
There's a good reason why, historians are saying that post-World War II, we entered the period called the Great Acceleration. It's that people now feel the pacing of their lives has accelerated to a point where they don't have time to care for themselves. They don't have time to care for family members.
I think our culture right now is profoundly burned out.
2/3 of Americans say that they're working more than 40 hours any given week. We have to work more in order to sustain the same level of living.
The labor movement in America is a surprisingly religious story, and it does often converge at the issue of Sabbath.
Shabbat is a revolutionary concept. It actually changed human history. For the first time, it introduced the concept of mandated rest.
The very heart of the idea is a kind of workers' rights idea.
Sabbath has ethical implications. Work should not be what defines us as human beings.
It's a commandment. It comes from God. That's why we observe Shabbat.
As a Christian, I don't think we take the Sabbath seriously enough.
If Sabbath rest was going to flourish and live in their lives, something else was going to have to die.
And I just never had an appreciation for the Sabbath day or understanding of it. All of that came to me recently. And I've been pastoring 34 years.
A lot of what it translates into is, I wish I just had more time in which I just paused to breathe, to think about what it was that I was actually chasing after.
We realize that time is our only non-renewable resource.
Latino Catholics identify with the story of Exodus, the story of the Israelites wandering the desert.
It's like the whole week is hectic, and then all of a sudden, you light the Shabbos candles, and you're in a different world.
Sabbath isn't simply a pious teaching. It's not an add-on. What's at issue is the very meaning of life.
There are lots of themes and ideas that emerge in that very quickly, Martin. But one of the things I want to ask about at first is the theme articulated by Professor Wurzbach at Duke when it refers to our modern age as a time of great acceleration. And in many ways, it seems that that's what the film is about, the question of how and whether the Sabbath concept of mandated rest is relevant in an increasingly busy and frenetic world. Is that a good way of describing at least a good portion of what the film is about?
Yeah, I think Norman puts his hand right on the nerve when he talks about that. You know, he's a friend of the McClendon Scholar Program. He's known to your people there. But you know, every time I go to present an idea to National Public Television for a new film, I have to go in and sit down in front of a large panel of people. And the basic question is, will this subject matter, Martin, that you're proposing reach a common denominator? Will it connect with mainstream America? And for my mindset, it does, because I focused immediately on the notion that what are we all feeling right now? We're all feeling a sense of burnout and stress, and we can't quite figure out a rhythm to our lives anymore. So much of that's been shattered. And Sabbath becomes a way to regulate the time of your week, time of your day, and to remind yourself that you have obligations beside yourself, that work doesn't define everything about you, and that we do have a formula of work and rest that's been given to us and handed down through the centuries. And maybe it's time to go back and revisit that. And that's the principle of the film, the basic undergirding of the film.
Good. And we look forward to talking about that. And in order to do it, I want to go ahead and bring in our other two panelists to join our conversation. First is Dr. Judy Fentress-Williams. Dr. Fentress-Williams is the Dodge Professor of Biblical Interpretation at Virginia Theological Seminary in Alexandria, Virginia. She sometimes refers to herself as bivocational because she is also on the staff at the historic Alfred Street Baptist Church in Alexandria, where she's Director of Christian Education. Judy's been with us on several occasions as a McClendon Scholar. We're delighted to see you with us again. And we'll say a little bit more about her work at the end, and particularly her book, Holy Imagination, which we highly recommend to all of you, and I'll share information on that later. Judy, welcome to the program and to the discussion.
Thank you, Theo. And it is always a delight to be a part of the McClendon Scholar Program, and it is a delight to see Martin. It's lovely to be here because I get to see some of my favorite folks all at once.
Well, we're so glad to have you. And our third panelist to join us is Reverend J. Dana Trent. Dana is an author, a teacher, and a minister who lives in Raleigh, North Carolina. She's the author of 4 books that offer spiritual guidance. And among those is For Sabbath's Sake, Embracing Your Need for Rest, Worship, and Community. And she's written a 5th book, a memoir. She seems a little young to me to be writing a memoir. But it's a fascinating story called Between Two Trailers, and it tells the story of her childhood and growing up with parents who were drug dealers, and her journey from that to her divinity degree and the work she does now. And we're delighted, Dana, to have you also with us for this discussion tonight.
Thank you so much, Theo. It's an honor to be here.
So, Judy, let me ask you a question just to start, if you would. You say in the clip we saw, as a Christian, we don't take Sabbath seriously enough. Say a little bit more about what you mean by that.
I think it's been an erosion over time. So I think that if we were to think back a few decades, stores weren't open on Sunday. You couldn't buy alcohol on Sunday. There were all of these, laws in effect that preserved and established a sense of Sabbath or Sunday for us as something separate and apart. I think over time, all of those things have relaxed a little bit. And as a result, we don't give Sabbath the same reverence that we may have given it in the past.
Are we, in what ways are we worse off for that, do you think?
Well, I think not having a set aside time for rest is contributing to this fatigue I think it heightens anxiety. It's not good for our health.
Mhm.
I could go on and on and on, but one of the things that Sabbath does in my mind is remind us that we are a part of the created order, that we aren't machines, that we need to stop. Sabbath holds space for that, and
Mhm.
that recenters and grounds us.
Mhm. Mhm. Dana, in your book, you say that as a child, even before you could name it, you knew that Sundays were different. And that then later, even in life, though you stepped outside of that rhythm, the lessons of Sabbath were still inside you. Say more about that a little bit and what that meant to you.
I grew up in two very small farm towns, one in Indiana and one in rural North Carolina. And it was this idea that transcending mundane time into sacred time was a requirement of the week. And it was something that was ingrained in us. We were raised in it, and any sort of person who remembers when they rolled up the sidewalks on Saturday night for Sunday Sabbath time remembers that feeling, and it's in our muscle memory. And so for me, even as a 42-year-old, Sabbath is in my bones, it's in my muscle memory. And so part of my journey has been getting back to that, getting back to those early years and that experience of allowing holy mystery to transcend the chaos.
Martin, did you have a strong Sabbath tradition when you were growing up?
I did. Maybe I always shudder to say this, but I grew up Roman Catholic, and Catholics have, I grew up at a time when missing church on Sunday was a mortal sin, and that is a heavy lift for an 8 or 9 or 10-year-old to think that, oh my God, I gotta get to church. And that was my experience. And what was interesting is you go through your period of rebelling against all of that. And I think in some ways that's what's happening in the nation. The nation's rebelling against the notion of, religious mandating, religion ordering me around. And then you, as an adult, you begin to remember, maybe there was a reason for this. Maybe it's actually for my benefit. Maybe it helps. Maybe there's something good about all this. And you start to go back and revisit it. So long ago, I did revisit it, and I chose on my own, not because I was mandated, but because I thought, this is good for me. This is who I am, and this is where I should be.
Dana and Judy, in the film, you both talk about the early church and how it practiced the Sabbath and the role it played, and how it sort of has evolved over time. So just share a little bit about that, your understanding. Maybe Dana, you start on your understanding of how the Sabbath evolved and the role it played in the early church.
The early Christians were assumed that Jesus would be back tomorrow, right? We know that the Gospels were written from that point of view. And so the idea was that the Sabbath time, the 8th day, was meant to be a little Easter, a little celebration of the second coming. And it was only until after those first few centuries, when Jesus did not return in those immediate years, that were such a part of the ethos of the early church, that the church began to understand and form the rituals and meaning that it needed to assign to those 8th day celebrations or 7th day celebrations. And so that's when we get to see community prayer in some of the earliest 3rd century literature. We read about early Christians gathering for community prayer, and we start to see the formation of liturgy and community and worship and rituals even before Constantine, even before Christianity is declared legal in the Roman Empire. But all of these rituals take shape in what is first a very eschatological environment, meaning that we believe that Jesus is going to come back tomorrow. Therefore, we need to have practices that remember these little Easters every week.
Judy?
I would add to that remember, the very, very, very first Christians were Jews. And so the practice of Sabbath was something that was always a part of this religious tradition. As the church expands and incorporates Gentiles, we get this shift, this growth, if you will, or expansion into this idea of Easter and Sunday. And all of that gets melded together with Sabbath. So one of the challenges, I think, for practitioners of Christianity today is to think about Sabbath as both worship and rest, or perhaps rest as an act of worship.
Say a little more about that, rest as an act of worship. That sounds interesting to me.
Well, I mean, if you think about what is said about our purpose in catechism, right? To glorify God and enjoy God forever.
Right.
As a part of the created order is a part of glorifying God, living into Sabbath rest. It seems to me this is very much rooted in what it means to be a part of God's creation.
Yeah.
This is a part of the rhythm of our existence as a part of creation. When we do so, we bring glory to God. That becomes an act of worship. And I guess that's appealing to me as someone who works as a religious leader to figure out how we can reclaim this idea of rest as worship.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's great. Let's look at another clip from the film, the opening part of the film that picks up on this theme about the acceleration of modern life.
Americans work hard, Americans work long hours, but the sheer reality of it too is that our wages have stagnated, so a lot of the overworking is actually also attributed to the fact that we have to work more in order to sustain the same level of living.
People are on edge, they're emotional, and I would say spiritual tanks are not full.
And in a global economy, the worries come at you from every place imaginable, right? People, even when they are not working, are thinking about their working. They're worried about what the competition is doing.
There's a lot of talk about unplugging, and there's an unplugging movement that we need to be able to not answer emails. We need to be able to turn off our computers and have time together, which I think is true. The thing that I think the unplugging movement misses is that we have to do this at the same time. Because if we don't, we're never really going to be able to relax. Because we don't trust that our coworker is unplugging too.
I'm a specialist in internal medicine, somatic diseases. And what do we have in somatic realities that seem to indicate stress? Well, one of the biggest expenditures in health plans are drugs for gastroesophageal reflux, that you have heartburn. It's a huge expenditure, and it is a symbol of stress.
Overworking or working so much, working so many hours has effects on all sorts of social aspects of our lives, including our relationships, certainly our ability to devote time to the people that we love, including our family members, our spouses, our children.
We also have a very big item of drugs for mood disorders, mild depression or moderate depression, and I think these are markers of a stressed out society where we might have to look for some other reset, some other remedy, and maybe the Sabbath could be that remedy.
All right, we want to talk a little bit about some of the things on this theme and from this clip. This clip shows Dr. Tonstad talking about the enormous cost of stress, both in terms of health and money. And it was interesting, I picked up the Washington Post today, there's an article on stress, and the opening line is, physicians and public health experts have pointed to one culprit time and again when asked why Americans live shorter lives than peers in nations with similar resources, especially people felt by chronic disease in the prime of life. And that culprit is stress. I'd like to talk about that a little bit. Is the doctor right that this might be a remedy? Judy and Dana, one of you want to comment on that? How can Sabbath get into the conversation here about stress in a helpful way?
So I definitely think that what regular Sabbath rest does is reset us. It's a point of reorientation. And it's just a way of reminding us there's something about, well, think about this from a liturgical perspective. When we worship and follow a particular liturgy, we are reinforming our identity or remembering who we are. Sabbath does that. Sabbath informs our identity, reminds us of who we are. And Dana mentioned this concept of alternate time, which is so lovely, right? Sabbath is that alternate time that reminds you your life is about more than what you produce and make.
So well said. Yes. And we're seeing this in terms of stress in our collective consciousness, and Dr. Vivek Murthy's Surgeon General's report that they released in May of this year, the idea that Dr. Murthy is calling for a culture of connection, right? And Sabbath is the original culture of connection. It is, in fact, the medicine that we need for our stressed out lives, because Sabbath is all about relationships. And as Christians, we know that to be true because Jesus practiced a relational Sabbath. And so I think what Sabbath does for us in terms of tools in our toolbox is help us be less alone together, which is sort of the rate that we're heading, even as we talked about COVID changing the way we look at time and work, but certainly adding to our collective stress. And so this idea that Sabbath could be the remedy for that, is the remedy for that, is the ancient medicine for modern woes, is a very accessible, formative one.
That just reminds me also of what used to happen in families with a Sunday dinner. That the meal on the Lord's Day was a special meal, right? Extended family. So when you talk about community and connection, this was the time and space when that happened every week. Yeah.
Of course,
that's exactly right. Mm-hmm.
Sabbath is about rest, but it's beyond that, it's mandated rest, which is one of the things we struggle with, right? And we've tried mandated rest in this country in a lot of different ways. The blue laws, which were mentioned earlier, and they're discussed in the film. And they've pretty much gone away because, well, people didn't want them, a variety of reasons, I guess. It's interesting, and I see in the chat a comment, someone lives in Bergen County, New Jersey, Martin. Yeah. And I remember the great piece in the film where you interview folks in Paramus, right? And they actually have kept their blue laws. Say a little about that.
Well, it took a while to find them, Theo, to find a community, a county that was actually holding on to what we would call the blue laws, closing down on Sunday. Yeah. And they're doing that in Bergen County, New Jersey. And they have more shopping malls than any other place in America. They do an enormous amount of retail sales, but they have come to realize that they can do as much selling 6 days a week that they would over 7 days. The same amount of dollars can be spent in 6 days as they are in 7. And so they have held on to these ancient traditional blue laws and feel as though they profit from it, because people want to move to Bergen County because they know they're going to get a day off. They want to work in that kind of a system, knowing that they're always going to have a Sunday off, and they can plan on that. And I'm not necessarily saying it's going to change the way everybody else does retail in America. Retail's got its own problems right now. But the truth of the matter is that I think they had the courage to say, we're going to stick with this. It's working. And they don't really see it first as a religious statement, but they know that the roots come out of a religious tradition, and they value them and they work.
So are there ways to, if not mandate rest, mandate going slower? That's sort of a Sabbath practice. Do we know of examples of that? We can exhort people within our congregations, and maybe that's the kind of mandated rest this becomes. Mainly it's an exhortation from within our community, as something we heavily promote. But Are there other ways we could, that it could be, if not mandated, strongly encouraged? Dana, thoughts on that? What, how do we,
I think one of
stop
the
short of blue laws, but encourage people in certain ways to go slower?
Rest is the enemy of capitalism, right? 100%. And so the idea, though, is where might we find pockets to slow down instead? If we're in a society and culture that is not, it's not conducive to rest for an entire 24 hours because of socioeconomic issues, justice issues, the labor movement. What are the ways in which we can invite people to holy time during their week? I'm a big proponent of accessible Sabbath. And so the idea, I teach my students, my freshmen and sophomores at Wake Tech, that you can have Sabbath moments in your day. You can step out of ordinary time in order to have deep breaths and a meditation practice or a prayer practice, if that is a part of your particular tradition. But this idea that we need 24 hours of Sabbath is simply not possible for many, many people for many reasons. And so I'm a big proponent of Sabbath moments, which I do think is a way of slowing down, because collectively those Sabbath moments invite us into a meaning-making rhythm that encompasses our entire life, so that we are learning that life is about meaning and not work, right? It's not the other way around. So I'm a big cheerleader of Sabbath moments.
I really love that. That's something that Patricia Hersey talks a lot about, the nap ministry. And I definitely want us to think about how we invite people to do that. I also think there are practical ways to have a Sabbath practice on a day, even if it's not answering your email or staying away from social media for a period of time once a week, and just live into the space that's provided when you're not being pulled by all of those other concerns. Some people have practices of not watching television, stepping away from some of those things. And that's a way of saying this is different time.
So
I was going to say that for me, and maybe we'll get to this towards the end of the webinar, but the word that has stayed with me throughout the whole course of the production and the post-production and everything else is that it is about rest. But fundamentally, Sabbath is about reaching a point of contentment. You can say it's Sunday, I'm going to go to church, I'm going to go and visit with my family, and still something's going on inside. You're still churning away inside, thinking about other things that are going on that you haven't done. Can you reach a point of contentment? Isn't that really the purpose of Sabbath? Not as much to sort of take a nap, but actually to say, I've done enough. It's the end of the week. I've done enough. I have enough. And I am enough. And all of that says, today is the day that belongs to God and me to take this moment and feel a sense, and let that sense of contentment for that one day come over you. And I think the only thing you can do that day then is rest, because you've reached this point of contentment and you say, I'm good. I'm good.
I love that concept of contentment.
Yeah.
I really do.
Yeah, that's a beautiful way to say it. So there are Sabbath moments that don't necessarily have to be on Sabbath. There are Sabbath actions, perhaps we might call some things that could or could not maybe be on Sabbath, but they're in the spirit of Sabbath. I'm struck by Judith Shulevitz's comment about the unplugging movement.
Yes.
I have not heard much of this, but I know this has been a cry that's been out there. There's sort of people needing breaks from our gadgets. That is a type of action. You mentioned some examples of that, Judy, of things one might do. Thoughts about unplugging as and how to build that into our lives?
Yeah. I have sent emails to students, 8:30, 9 o'clock at night, and I get a little message back that they will answer their email tomorrow morning at 8 a.m. that there's a period of time that they have set aside for this. And that is a wonderful message to me. If they're unplugged, maybe I need to be unplugged. Maybe it's time to set that down and show up tomorrow. It's time to work tomorrow at this time, but access to a computer in our house, a smartphone, there's access to all of that, but that doesn't mean we should be connected.
Yeah. Another area in the film that gets talked about some, Martin, if you recall the interview with sociologist Tricia Bruce about the negative effects of stress and overworking on social relationships. Seems like this is fertile territory for Sabbath practice, sort of insights, lessons that might help us in our relationships and particularly in our family life.
Yeah, no, the data is pretty self-evident. You know, we are feeling more stressed out. Divorce rates are going up. People feeling as though they don't have time for their children. We're all suffering from all these kinds of, and you know, so many people. Let's be honest. I mean, one of the big changes that's happened in the last generation or two, so many people are to some degree self-employed. They have control over their own time, and then there's this terrible tension. The more I work, the more I make, and so. Do I stop making? You know, just to, you know, it's a totally different way. Because I think when we talked about the blue laws in the 1930s, 40s, 50s, most people were employed by the employer, and they could ask for their certain time off. Oh, so many of us now are under some kind of a program where we're self-employed, and so we have this tension between making money and taking the time off and feeling a guilt about taking the time off. But there's no question about the fact that people are feeling much more stressed out than ever before. And I think that not only, you know, the more I've become convinced that not only is Sabbath helpful for the physical sense of rest, but we have a mental health crisis in this country. We realize it, we know it, it's topical, it's on everybody's lips. And I'm not saying, I wouldn't propose that Sabbath is necessarily the balm for mental health, but it should probably be considered one of the many components to begin to ease the stress that sort of agitates the mental illness that we're all going through right now, the mental tensions that we have.
What are some ways Sabbath opportunities, if you will, for family? Obviously, there are the ones of worship, which we know and would encourage, but it doesn't have to necessarily be worship to be a Sabbath moment with a family. I assume you would say. Thoughts on how we can use Sabbath practices to bind our closer together?
So
go ahead, Sam. I'm sorry, Judy.
Go.
I love the idea of letting children lead us, you know, your adult children, your teenage children, your littles, your niece and nephew, your neighborhood children. It's the idea that children are always in a state of wonder, and they pull us into the present moment. And I don't think there's anything more Sabbath than that. And so I love the idea of in our families, allowing our children to lead the way towards Sabbath. And sometimes that's tricky, right? Especially if our children love their iPads and their video games, going full circle to the unplugged comment that we had a minute ago. But this idea of children want us, beg us, yearn for us to be in the present moment with them. And so I think for families, perhaps it starts with helping the children lead in Sabbath, meaning making practices and rituals.
Yeah,
I love that. When I think about Sabbath as an opportunity to remember we're a part of the created order, I love the idea of connecting with nature on the Sabbath. If we don't do it any other time of the week, to be outside, to remember our place in this order. Again, this idea of resting means that there are limitations to our being, and that we're part of something larger than ourselves, and being in nature constantly reminds us of that.
You know, I think too that Sabbath is like a blank slate that invites us to be creative. To think how we can make this moment rich and full and meaningful. in a myriad of different ways, whether it's foods or musics or time you spent together playing games, whatever way it is. But it's an invitation given to us by God to create a new moment and take that over. I gave a presentation, I guess, a couple of weeks ago in Pittsburgh, at Pittsburgh Theological Seminary, and they took call-ins, and somebody called in somewhat agitated saying, I am the only caretaker for my mother, and nobody else is going to take care of her if I'm not here to take her. I'm not sure how I can. I'm not thinking in terms of Sabbath. And I felt for, there are people who really are in a situation that they're going to have to be really weighing the balances of taking time off that we would call Sabbath. And my only thought was, well, maybe it's possible that you can make that moment, that Sabbath moment, meaningful for yourself and your mother. Just by lighting the candle, just by saying one of her favorite poems, just by creating an environment, a moment that says this moment right now is a Sabbath moment, and it's different from what we do during the course of the week. So I just think that Sabbath is an opportunity to sort of flex our creative muscles, and that's what I think that's part of God's intention.
It's beautiful, and I really like these creative ideas. We're going to mention them again, sort of as we get near the end, summarize some of the things we've talked about, and try to leave people with some ideas on things they might add to their own practice. Let's watch the third clip we have, which raises another issue for us, and in relating to the speed of our lives these days.
In the 1970s, a psychology professor from Princeton University and a PhD student from Princeton Seminary devised their own experiment in human behavior that would come to be known as the Good Samaritan Project.
And they managed to divide a group of Princeton Seminary students into 3 groups, and they gave them a task across campus. And they knew that all of these students were familiar with the parable of the Good Samaritan, and so theoretically they would be predisposed to helping somebody in need.
They gave them all personality tests, and then they split them into 3 groups. They said to one group, you have plenty of time to get there, don't worry, it's in an hour. And they said to another group, it's pretty soon, you gotta move on, you're okay, you're gonna make it. And they said to another group, you're late, get over there right away.
The real test was that these researchers had positioned an actor along the way who was kind of in this alleyway, appeared to be having a medical situation.
They wanted to know how many people from each group would stop and help this man, or at least ask what was wrong.
And they tested for personality, they tested for their familiarity with this parable, but the only predictor of whether they stopped to help this person was whether or not they were in a hurry. And the more they were in a hurry, the less likely they were to stop and help the person.
So they concluded from that being in a hurry undermines your altruism, your ethical sense.
And it's difficult to care for things that we're just zooming by. And to bring it back to the Sabbath, I think the Sabbath is like, wait, stop. Let this impact your pace of life.
All right, let's talk a bit about this Good Samaritan project. What do you make of the conclusion of this experiment, that being in a hurry undermines our sense of altruism or our ethical sense? Dana, what do you think of that when you see that experiment?
It's absolutely true, of course. And the thing that comes to mind for me is that Sabbath is a fulcrum commandment. It's if the Sabbath if the 10 commandments were a slice of pie, Sabbath is the biggest slice of the pie in terms of the length and content, right? It packs a punch. But the idea is that the Sabbath commandment is one that connects our relationship with God and our relationship to one another. That's why we call it a fulcrum commandment. And so the idea is if we are neglecting Sabbath, we invariably are neglecting our role in that fulcrum, our connection with God, but then more importantly, what God teaches us to be connected to one another.
Yeah. Other thoughts on this? What are the ways that hurry makes it harder to be effective? I mean, in some ways this is self-evident, but I think it's helpful to think about the hurry of our lives and how it may keep us from responding to those in need.
Well, it's interesting because when we're in a hurry, the assumption is that the thing that we are rushing to is the most important thing. And this happens so often when we have a list of things that we're trying to rush through, that somehow our orientation is off. We're off-centered already. And that is exactly what happens when we don't have enough rest. We're off-center, we're off-kilter. We don't have the right priorities. And there is something about rest that helps us to get things in a better order. Yeah.
I think that I first of all, I didn't go into the research looking to tell the Good Samaritan story. But when I came across it and it was connected to Princeton Theological Seminary, it just was, duh. This has to be in the film. And so I fought all the way through the process of making the film to include that. And it's not the most scientific study. It isn't. It's just, 40. It's two Princeton professors who decided to try this experiment with theological students. With theological students. I mean, these people who know the story of the Good Samaritan, and they set them up. And when we heard that, I just thought, isn't this an indictment on the fact that how many of us use our hurriedness? Does it shape our lack of empathy? I'm not sure if it does, but it certainly becomes the excuse. It becomes the reason why we just don't have time. We're too busy. I'd love to do it, but I can't. And that's the way I think most of us are victims of our own time commitments. I mean, the story was not scientific, and yet somehow it rang true. Everybody we've shown that clip to and talked about that, it meant something to them. And what I also love is, after we hear these stories, I have to go out and make it into a television presentation. And I started to do some research, and what lovely artwork that's been done throughout the course of history. Rembrandt and Gustave Doré and people like that doing great work on the Good Samaritan story. Just lovely, evocative imagery of the Good Samaritan story, and how perfectly that aligned, we thought, with this theme on Sabbath.
In the film, there are a number of examples of Sabbath community sharing or giving in various ways. Is this a key, perhaps, to the revival of the Sabbath in some ways? Is this a kind of thing that our communities could be doing more of? I know I didn't grow up necessarily with a sense that you served on the Sabbath. But there seems to be a number of people grabbing onto that as a way of expressing their Sabbath time. What about that as a kind of practice we might encourage with our faith communities?
I think service is an integral part of community. A community can be defined in many different ways. And so community can certainly just be about connection, but also about doing something together. And Barbara Brown Taylor has the famous quote of, "The community that rests together is equipped to resist together." And so this is the idea too, that Judy mentioned the components of rest and worship. You get rest, worship, and then you are equipped to be community together. Whether that means going out together and being of service to your larger community, or whether that means of being of service to each other in your church community, in your faith community, in your family, in your worshiping community. Going back to Martin's example of those who are caregiving, being of service in a season of life when you are caregiving for parents or relatives or children or your significant other. Community takes many different shapes, but it's the idea that that rest that Judy was talking about is what equips us to be of service to each other.
We used to have a long list of things we didn't do on the Sabbath. People's lists varied, and they're mentioned, and the people in the film talk about it some. There's an interesting comment from Susanna Heschel in the film about how when she was in her family growing up, there were certain things they didn't talk about. We didn't talk about things that were divisive, were depressing, horrifying. We didn't talk about the atrocities in Vietnam. We didn't talk about the Holocaust. Those were not compatible with the atmosphere of Shabbat. Is this a practice we might also do, things not to talk about on Sabbath, or what?
Yeah, I think it would be helpful when we're talking about Sabbath to pair what we're not doing with what we are doing, so that we don't think about Sabbath as a list of no's. So I'm not doing this thing so I can rest, so I can worship, so I can be creative. So Martin gave this description of the creative moment, which was a lovely definition of recreation, which we often think of as kind of fun and busyness and games. And it's all those things, but it is also engaging the creative part of us. So when we make that list of things that we aren't doing, we want to be conscious of the fact of what we're saying yes to. And I think that helps people get their mind around Sabbath, so that it's not just a list of things that you cannot do, but look at what gets opened up over here when we step away from these things.
Dana, in your book, you talk about your book on Sabbath, you talk about encouraging people to create their own Sabbath plan. Say a little bit about that and what you might suggest in that regard.
I'm chuckling because it's the teacher in me, right? To create a lesson plan with student learning outcomes. But what I love about this is that, as Judy was mentioning, the recreation, the creation is the intention, right? It's the idea of a Sabbath plan, whether it's for yourself, your family, your worshiping community, is that you bring some intention and some purpose to it. And that is the wonder and the joy and the idea of, Judy says, don't stress the legalism, right? It's not about the no's, it's about the what are we going to do? And so I love the idea of Sabbath plans for individuals, worshiping communities, and families, because it helps bring the intention, the purpose, which again helps us embrace that holy mystery and step out of the ordinary and into the sacred.
And this plan would include things that I, as an individual, might do or want to suggest to my community. It could be a combination of any of the kinds of things we've been talking about, right?
Yes, it could be any combination. And when we bring groups together to talk about these Sabbath plans, just really specific examples, we have large pieces of beautiful paper and markers and crayons and paint. And children lead the way in making a Sabbath plan for their families so that they have some creative endeavor together. They take the beautiful poster or their creation home with them, and it's there in their home or in their worshiping community to remind them of their sacred time when they made a plan for what they'd like for their Sabbath days or moments to look like together.
Judy, part of your bivocation is pastor. Sabbath worship is such a thing we think about so much as a part of keeping the Sabbath. Say a little bit about your sense of what we're doing right and what we're doing wrong in terms of worship, and how we might make that more a part of an awareness of Sabbath.
Yeah. Well, one of the things that I've observed in our post-pandemic world is that not everyone has returned to in-person worship. And that some people are worshiping in person 2 Sundays out of the month and at home 2 Sundays. And I'm intrigued by this if in fact people are getting more rest. Is there some rest in not having to get your children in their Sunday finest and get everybody in the car? And can we find ways of capturing more rest on this day of worship? If you're in a tradition where people get really, really dressed up for church, and I'm from a tradition that's like that, my ancestors often had to work in demeaning jobs. It meant a lot to get dressed up on a Sunday and look a certain way and get that respect that comes from dressing in very nice clothes. And I appreciate that and I value it. I also am desirous of space where people don't have to do that if it means there's more rest in their day.
Yeah. That's dangerous territory for a minister to start affirming that staying home from church might be.
Don't tell my boss I said that.
But no, the emphasis on rest is beautiful, and if that's really the purpose in a certain way. Martin, there was a piece in the one of the clips you did with the Benedictine monks. That was in terms of their practice that intrigued me. This idea of Lectio Divina, I believe it's called. And that, say a little about that, but that's a practice some might be interested in as on Sabbath or as a Sabbath practice at other times.
Yes, it comes out of the rule of Saint Benedict. Benedict was he was just one of the most beautiful characters in the history of Christianity. He really was. You know, in the 500s, he's devising this notion of gathering his community in regular intervals of prayer. And so we wanted to go. We went to Spencer, Massachusetts, to St. Joseph's Monastery, and they're up at 3:30 in the morning. They pray 7 times. The monks pray 7 times a day. And my question, well, what makes Sabbath any different than Monday through Saturday? And yet it was. Sabbath was a very different rhythm for that one particular day, directed by Saint Benedict himself, going back 1,500 years. So Benedict was thinking about this 1,500 years ago, that Sabbath would be different, a different day. And he encouraged the monks to take a different kind of rhythm and to read sacred scripture, to learn to read, first of all. And this is, 500 and 600, when the beginning of the order, when most people were illiterate. And he's insisting that the brothers learn to read, number one, that they read the scriptures and sacred readings, and that they teach others to read. So the whole notion of literacy, it immediately ties to the whole notion of Sabbath, at least in the Benedictine tradition. And I thought that was a beautiful, dimension to thinking in terms of Sabbath and the wider scope of things, that it was actually contributing to the betterment of the cultures at the time, because the brothers learned to read, they read scripture, and they taught others to read.
And for a Christian looking for a practice that they wanted to do on their own on Sunday or at another time, immersing oneself in sacred text as a practice, we could do worse than that.
No, I think it's I do it myself. I think it's a wonderful thing to do on your Sabbath, just to take the time and sort of let your mind rest in the text. There's a whole notion of not just doing nothing, but to let your mind rest in the text, to meditate, to think about the text. I think that's a great gift. If you have the time and you can do it, I think it's a great gift.
As we think about some of the practices and all of Sabbath and worship, there's a question from Rebecca Waugh. She says, in the film, I was drawn to the candle lighting moment greeting Shabbat and the notion that Shabbat arrives on its own time and not ours. I wonder if those of us who mark Sunday as our Sabbath would benefit by a Saturday evening sundown start, switching gears the night before, something like that. Comments on that.
Absolutely. I grew up with Seventh-day Adventist cousins and observed the way they welcomed Sabbath. And in my own practices, as I think about things that I don't do on the Sabbath, I try to think about it from sundown to sundown. I am a professor and I often have to teach on Monday, but that means that I'm not thinking about those things until sundown on Sunday. So there's this block of time where I'm away from that. And I love the idea of us creating and keeping rituals that mark this time, that special time.
The other phrases that from Professor Wurzba that really caught me in the film, where he says near the end, the purpose of Sabbath is not just stopping, but figuring out how to deal with our restlessness. A lot in that. Just be interested in comment on it, thoughts about it, and how can Sabbath help us to do that? It helps us find our place of who we really are. I guess that is at the core, dealing with our restlessness, but thoughts on how it's more than stopping, it's figuring things out about ourselves.
I think part of the reason I was attracted to the storyline in the first place was because fundamentally, Sabbath is countercultural. You know, the culture says go, go, go. Sabbath says go, and then stop. The culture says always be on edge, always be ready. And Sabbath says, this is a time, this is a moment when you should stop. And as Norman says, you know, do something with this restlessness. We're all feeling that. We've been using the terms burned out and stressed, but I think restlessness it's an epidemic in our time. And we have the tools to be constantly going, constantly searching, constantly engaged. And I think the instantaneousness of our culture requires us to be constantly ready. And I think we're finding ways to rebel against that. So I think it is a matter of deciding we're going to put away the restlessness, choose contentment, but also to say, look, you know, today's my day. I'm giving this to myself, to my family, and to God. And that, I think, is a way to take care of some control for that one day of the restlessness.
There's another question from Sarah Bond about talking about this reality we mentioned a little bit earlier about since COVID, less people are coming to church in person. And in some ways that may be a good thing as it gives options. But in general, of course, a number of people, even before COVID, attend religious services on decline. And she's asking about how would you recommend we communicate the importance of practicing Sabbath and make it more central, I think is the point in our faith community. Thoughts on that?
Community is important. As we have heard, Dana's talked about this, Martin's mentioned this, the importance of community. I think part of what we want to do is promote, honor, celebrate community, but celebrate it in all of its iterations. Clearly, it's ideal if we find ways to connect other than on Zoom. But Zoom's not going away. And so how do we find a way to live into all of these ways of gathering? Yeah.
What I love, I totally agree with Judy. And what I love most about it is that it's accessible. I love the accessibility of the new ways in which we are doing church. Going back to Martin's caregiving example, you know, those who are in the midst of very stressful caregiving situations, those who are exhausted from working several jobs, those who are coping with illness. Zoom Church provides connection and community and spirituality for those who may be unable to attend a worship service in person. And what a gift that is, that we have the tools and the science and the technology to provide folks with some connection, even the folks here tonight who are logging in from all across America. I mean, that's a testament and a testimony to these tools.
Say a little more about the balance between practicing Sabbath as an individual and in a community. Is some part of community celebration essential really for understanding for real practice of Sabbath? And how do those two things balance? Because we've talked about some things we can do as individuals and collective worship and collective action. Say a little more about that, Dana.
Maybe I'm old school, but there's something to me that's really just life-giving and fulfilling to be in the midst of a people who are in one voice in prayer, one voice in song, and I'm part of that. And you can't get that with Zoom, really. And you feel the energy and you feel the connectedness through the prayer, through the song, and through the moment, the exchanges, you know, signs of peace, whatever it is that we're doing within that community. We become part of something bigger than ourselves. I think when you're sitting at home, and Zoom is a great option, but when you're in a community of people together with others that are trying to bring the divine into their lives right alongside you, I think there's really it just goes beyond words. It's so impossible to describe it, but that's exactly what's happening. And I think in some ways we're trying to find the balance now. I mean, we didn't choose to go to Zoom. We went to Zoom like that. That was it. I mean, everything shut down. There was no choice. You know, all the pastors said, you know, let's start doing something a little different next week. We'll be back to regular church services in about 2 or 3 weeks here. You
Yeah.
watch. And
Yeah.
and it didn't happen. And so everybody's running around now trying to figure out how can we keep this communication open. And so we hard pressed into the virtual engagement. People learn how to do that, some better than others. But now we're trying to find a little stability. And I think just the notion that people are coming back says how much they missed it, how much they long for it. Some of them will stay home. Some of it will find the convenience just too much to give up. But the truth of the matter is, I think a lot of people are more than happy to come back in and engage, to stand beside their brothers and sisters in a common voice and common song.
Yeah. In the film, Dana, you talk about how in some ways the suddenness of COVID coming upon us was like a Sabbath. And I thought of that as Martin was describing that. And then you say it's an invitation to examine our lives. Do you have a sense that a lot of that kind of examination happened as you talk with groups and read and listen? Did you think it was a period of that for a lot of people?
I do. And I think it began that way because we were thinking about death. Death was on every doorstep all the time. It was on our minds and in our hearts. And so that was certainly at the forefront of our minds, that mandatory Sabbath of considering meaning making, which is what all humans do, no matter their tradition. So I think absolutely. And the interesting part about COVID is that the time became very like wavy, and the lines between sacred, ordinary time became very blurry, right? Because we're on iPads at home doing our worship services. And so as we emerged out of COVID, we got to keep the tools that provide us accessibility. But going to Martin's comment and to Judy's comment, I think before COVID, I would have said rest was the most urgent category out of those three: rest, worship, and community. And now I say it's worship and community. And I say that because of the epidemic of loneliness, because now coming out of COVID, we have the data to show us that, our loneliness is as dangerous as smoking, 15 cigarettes a day, and leads to cardiovascular illness and also dementia. And so not practicing Sabbath is becoming deadly, and we have the data to show us that. And so I would say that those are the two categories that we now, as a community and as a society, are reckoning with.
Early on after the clip, we posed the question of that the doctor had posed about whether Sabbath might be a remedy for some of the stress that is out there. I think your comments indicate that indeed it could be in many ways. It really is a Sabbath practice of rest and renewal, as you've been describing, really is an antidote to much of what's wrong. Then the question is how to get there, how to spread this practice without it raising images of blue laws and restrictions and can-dos and must-dos. And I really appreciated a lot of the discussions you all have had about very practical things that one can do as an individual, or in community to practice Sabbath. Journey Films has put together some materials some of you might want to look at on their website that has some list of Sabbath practices and some suggestions of things you might add to your life when looking for how to have more of a sense of Sabbath in oneself and also perhaps in community. And you list things like obviously attending a worship service, having a tech Sabbath, having some sort of a break, dedicating one Sabbath day per month where there is no work and you do other activities like reading. There are ways to make this plan. You talked about, Dana, that one can incorporate a number of different things that suggest a communal meal as a thing to do on a Saturday. And of course, various practices of prayer. So there are so many different ways. It isn't just going to church on Sunday morning. That is a way of practicing the Sabbath. As we get near the end, I'd like to just invite actually each of you, if you would, to take a few moments and share some comments, some final comments you want to make about lessons from Sabbath that we can take with us and use in our lives. So, Martin, if would you mind starting on that, and then Judy and Dana, just a few summary comments for us of some things we can learn from Sabbath that were highlighted in the film Sabbath.
I found it really interesting how many people, when I would ask them about Sabbath, immediately went to a memory that was rather legalistic. I remember the list of things that you can't do. This was forbidden. They would laugh about it sometimes too. Stores were all closed. Very legalistic understanding of it. And I think in some ways we tried to sort of offer a correction to that in the film, and to remind people that that's a memory that might have caused you to walk away from Sabbath, to leave it as part of your past. But I think it's maybe it's worth going back and revisiting, to rethink the gift that really is Sabbath. I know I have, and it's meant a lot to me in my own life to be able to do that. And I think that was one of the first lessons I learned. It was quite surprising, and I think that's also true for Christians. One of the nicest comments that we got, we were filming in Los Angeles, and we spent a week at an inner city Catholic church in Los Angeles, Hispanic. And at the end, it was lively, it was vibrant, mariachi music. It was a big show for the weekend that we were there. It was we did 60 baptisms over a weekend, 60 baptisms. It was just a wonderful experience to be out there. At the end, the pastor comes to me and says, thank you. And I said, no, it's us that should be thanking you for giving us the invitation to be here. And he said, no, thank you for making me think about Sabbath. I've been a pastor for all these years. I don't think I've really ever thought about it. And now this is an opportunity for me to go deeper with it and to think about it. I think it's just time I think Sabbath is an invitation waiting to be picked up and run with right now. And I think it's the perfect moment.
Judy?
One of the things that preparing for filming in this movie helped me to synthesize was the power between the commandment to keep the Sabbath that we see in Exodus versus the one we see in Deuteronomy. And in Exodus, the justification is that we are part of creation. And I've talked a little bit about what it means to be a part of God's creation, to be a creature, a part of God's order. Deuteronomy is very compelling for me because God says to the Israelites, remember you were slaves. There was a time when you did not have control over whether you worked or rested. And so the practice of a Sabbath is actually a sign of our freedom and our liberation. We choose to rest. It's not that someone's forcing us to, but we have the freedom to say we need rest. And in that way, practicing the Sabbath for me is very much an act of liberation, that we understand who we are in God, we celebrate it, and we're grateful for the freedom we have.
Thank you. Dana?
I loved being a part of this film journey in this community because it reminded me that the why of a thing is what keeps it relevant. It's the why that sustains the how. And so for me, when it comes to Sabbath and thinking it through for the documentary, I just kept coming back to time, the why of time, the assignment of meaning making that we have been given as part of God's creation. And we can always, make, do, buy, have more stuff, but we don't have more time. And so the idea is, how then will we number our days wisely?
Thank you so much, Dana and Judy and Martin. This was a great discussion. We touched on a lot of themes, and it's a rich, and as you said at the beginning, Martin, very deep and layered subject. I hope that you all have found some insight here about the meaning of Sabbath, and more than that, even some ideas about how you might make it more real in your life. Again, there will be a video, a recording of this film, of this webinar, and you'll be receiving notice of that and have an opportunity if you want to look at certain portions or comments that were made again, or share it with others. So I want to thank Dana and Judy and Martin for this discussion. And I want to share just a few announcements with you as we close. First of all, I want to urge you to learn more about the work of our guests this evening. This in particular, as I said, Dana is the author of 4 books. This one in particular is relevant to our discussion for Sabbath's sake. I find it very full of practical insights and suggestions, and really commend it to you, as well as learning more about her work in general on other subjects, but I think particularly relevant for tonight. I also want to commend to you Judy Fentress-Williams' recent book from 2021, Holy Imagination. And it's an introduction, as it says, to the entire Bible, to the whole Bible. It is a really remarkable commentary, and introduction to looking at the Bible from a literary point of view. So I really commend that to you, and for the discussions, of course, about the Sabbath, but many other biblical themes. The next thing is I want to really remind you about Journey Films. Some of you are very familiar with Journey Films. We saw in the comments earlier that you've seen 1, 2, 3, sometimes more of Martin's films through the years. But I urge you to go to the website, learn more about it, buy some copies of some of the films for use in your churches or in organizations. They make wonderful discussion programs. So really urge you to learn more about what's available there at www.journeyfilms.com. I'm a particular fan of the Prophetic Voices series, 5 really brilliant biographies of some of the giants of faith from the 20th century. And so I urge you to learn more about that and expose yourself to more of these films. I also want to tell you about the next McClendon Scholar Program, which is coming up. The next one scheduled is January 13th, and we'll be sending you more information about that. It's MLK weekend, and Reverend James Forbes will be the featured speaker, and very appropriate to have him on that weekend. And finally, to remind you that you can learn more about all of our programs, what are coming up, and those that are in the past at our website, nyapc.org/MSIR. Thanks again for attending. And as we close, I want to offer just 2 words of closing from our speakers, words from Dana and Judy. And as I share those final quotes from them, I invite you to also in chat type in a final comment, something you learned, maybe an insight you got about Sabbath, or something that you see you want to apply in your life. Take a moment and type that in. I think sometimes when we write down insights, they stay with us for a longer time. So final word this evening from the film, from Dana Trent, who says in the film, when we rest together, when we worship together, we are equipped then to go out into the world and do the work together. And the final comment in the film is from Judy Fentress-Williams. Was the establishment of the Sabbath for God or for us? In other words, by God setting an example of resting, is God saying this is what it means to be part of creation? Thank you so much for being with us, and good night.